Good afternoon, everyone. Absolutely delighted to be here. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and the land on which we meet and their elders past and present. My deep thanks to the United Nations Association for inviting me today, and my she's deep in work over here, but I acknowledge the director, Beth Shaw, a very old friend, and I have thrown out the organising framework of my speech to basically change the thrust of what I was saying to you. I want you to all vote pink by the end of my speech, promoting equality between men and women. And so my speech will be dedicated towards the new campaign of both making you vote pink, but also to write in an inequality goal, which I'll explain the importance of why that's so important to have a broader inequality goal written in on your framework. And because I used to work for UNHCR, I would also like you to write in durable solutions for refugees and IDPs at the bottom. So I'm going to have a bit of a campaign angle to my speech, but my general thrust of this paper this afternoon is talking about what is new and what is old. Something old, something new, something borrowed and something blue in the development agenda, the blue being the UN, and what is unfortunately very old about the development agenda has been the inability to move women from the sidelines to the centre of the global development agenda. And I'll talk about these transformative shifts in the post-2015 debate just not going anywhere near far enough and why. And I will also talk about what is new and what the implications of new trends in development thinking are for us. And there's something borrowed I'm going to take from the G20 development agenda, because I want us to, the UN in particular, to think much more broadly about a beyond aid agenda and how it could actually get its architecture working in the kind of beyond aid development space a little bit more effectively. So let's start. Lakshmi Puri was the one who came up with the line about moving women from the sidelines to the centre of the development agenda, and she did it as she was stepping down as the acting director of the institution UN Women. And by the end of this speech, I'm going to come up with a absolutely foolproof and fail-proof 4-point test for how you can be sure that gender issues have been picked up adequately in the post-2015 debate, and funding for UN Women is going to be a big one of those. So first I'm going to talk about, look, where are we at in the less than 1,000 days we've got towards the end of the MDGs? So what is old about the development debate is the fact that we have not made progress in any real sense on the gender-related goals globally. There is so much talk about cultural relativity and very much interesting talk, but the fact is that globally no country has made the sort of progress that we expected around MDGs 3 and 5. Now, there are reasons for that, and there are structural inequalities in social decision and economic decision making that make that so. But one would hope that because of the amount of data and evidence we've been able to collect about the inability to progress goals 3 and 5 the way that other goals have been progressed, that might have some real impact on the post-2015 discussion. And yet I believe it has not, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about why I think that to be so. So, what have we got in the post-2015 agenda? I don't know how to turn the screen on so people can see it. But if you see the transformative shifts, they're quite interesting, especially I like Leave No One Behind. It's a very Navy SEALs sort of thing. Very military idea. But what we do have in terms of the progress of the high-level panel on the post-2015 agenda, the lobbying has been agreed that we would have a standalone gender goal, a goal on gender equality to mainstream the gender perspective in other goals, and that's been agreed to. And what it looks like at the moment is that the goal will have, it will measure social protections, but also ensure the equal right of women to own and inherit property, sign a contract, register a business and open a bank account. There's also a goal about early and forced marriage, and there's a range of other goals that have been kept around maternal mortality rates, but also participation of women in the labour force. Now, the current goals, if we don't know them, and we don't have the advantage of putting the goals up on the board because they flew away. The goals that relate to women. Number 3 has the first indicator of number 3, which is about equal numbers of boys and girls in primary school, has been generally successful around the world, although the quality of that level of learning has been somewhat under discussion, as we've heard, and some parts of the world less so than others. There's still some structural issues, but generally speaking, the role of getting girls in primary school has been successful to some extent. But the other two, increase in women's wages outside the agricultural sector and an increase on women's seats in parliament at all levels, have been pretty badly, the progress has been very bad. In terms of the maternal mortality and reproductive health goals in number 5, they have also been very bad. So I suppose most gender advocates, development advocates, were really expecting to see something much stronger here about the participation of women in economic decision-making, in peace and security decision-making, and in political decision-making. Is one of these transformative ideas. And even though there are indicators and there is, as I said, a new goal around women's abilities to sign contracts and etc., there has not been the transformative shift about saying 3 and 5 did not and might not be achieved because we've got structural inequality in the way women are able to participate in decision making. So if we think about in the Pacific having a poverty of opportunity, I want you to think of women and girls still having a poverty of voice in decision making. So what we were expecting to see as well is some sort of acknowledgement of women's place in the care economy, and we were also interested in seeing some sort of a greater, one of the big criticisms of the MDGs generally was that it didn't deal with conflict and fragility. So in other words, the development goals were predicated on a state remaining stable and not experiencing any deep conflict or natural disaster. Now the new post-2015 discussion very much has conflict and fragility at the heart of it, because the new thinking is that extreme poverty in our future will only exist in conflict and fragile states, which is quite exceptional thinking. It's a long way. When we started out in our development thinking, we thought about poor people in poor nations. Now at this moment, we're thinking about poor people in middle-income nations, so-called pockets of poverty. But in our future, we're thinking of poverty existing only in conflict-affected and fragile states. So in other words, getting the conflict and fragile state goal in the post-2015 debate right, and having that include the gendered experience of conflict and fragility right up in lights, is really, really important. And that is not what we've seen so far. Now, the other thing that's quite important is, as I said, the idea of economic empowerment. And what were we expecting to see there? Well, we were expecting to see a greater acknowledgement, even if the way we think about poverty is still predicated on formal economy, income in formal economies, which has very gendered outcomes. So the way the World Bank has calculated extreme poverty of $1.25 a day is predicated at some point in your engagement in a formal economy. So the critique has always been, well, what about a whole lot of women who are engaged in the care economy who just never get counted at all, or who don't have that contribution to the economy counted in any way? So even our ideas about poverty are gendered, and we don't seem to be able to measure poverty in a way that is fair to both men and women and girls and boys. So let's have a think about that and ways we can measure poverty and think about poverty. But even on the formal equality, poverty measures that we have at the moment, women fare worse on every income inequality measure you can think of. And most economic policies and institutions, including, I'm afraid, the bank until fairly recently, have failed to take a lot of these gender disparities into account, from tax and budget systems to trade regimes. So there's this idea that gender-blind policies don't necessarily have gender-neutral outcomes. And the reasons are because women are actually, in reality, lag far behind men in access to land, access to credit, and access to decent jobs, even though we now have a growing body of research, economic research, that says that if you enhance women's economic options, it also will boost national economies. And we clearly have higher gender equity levels and a higher overall GNI levels, a close association in the economic literature. We know that macroeconomic policies and policy making can make connections to gender equality for better or for worse. So we know that when you, for example, in Europe, have an austerity measure that is so-called gender blind, it can have gender impacts. For example, immediately closing 1/3 of all the women's refuges in the UK, closing all the women's shelters in Greece, causing job losses in the public sector that vastly affected teachers, nurses, health workers, and not to mention the knock-on effects for the care economy when all the state-run care institutions closed. We know women are more likely than men to be in vulnerable employment almost all around the world, with rates from 32 to 85% in various regions, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, versus 55% to 70% for men. We know the recent food crisis, for example, led to stunting in girls under 5 at a rate significantly higher to boys under 5. So we know that all these macroeconomic decisions lead to very real gendered outputs, and yet there has been no push to have women represented in economic decision-making bodies in any real sense. So why is all the civil society agencies around the world lobbying so hard for an inequality goal? Why is that? Don't we have a standalone gender goal? Why do we also need an inequality goal? And the reason is because despite the language clearly set out in the UN Charter, really there's been an absence of serious focus on the issue of inequality, income inequality in international institutions. So we know that 1.2 billion poorest people account for only 1% of world consumption. We all know that. And yet, there has not been in any way any sort of political momentum about changing that type of statistic. So this leave no one behind idea is very important, but they did not in fact recommend an inequality goal. What they did recommend was a social protection goal, which is a good start, and that's the idea of having a pension, an old age pension, a widow's pension, some sort of vague welfare floor, which is a very important measure. So let's talk about, that's economic decision making. Now what about political decision making, which is also just flatlined at 20% and has not gone very well in our region whatsoever. So can we in fact have a transformative shift in development where the political decisions, not just the economic decisions, are being made almost entirely by 80% by men? So my view is of democratic institutions that poor representation of women in parliaments undermines the legitimacy of that government. And there's some few signs of improvement but in our region, particularly in the Pacific. But what we do know is what works. We know what type of electoral systems work. We do know what type of reserve seats work. We know where people have made those types of changes to their electoral system, that more women have been elected. So we do know what works. Now the question is now how important it is to make that work and to have those changes made to electoral systems. So we know in the Pacific we hold just 3% of seats in national parliaments in the Pacific compared to 20% in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. In South Asia, women hold only 7% of ministerial positions and 15% of national parliaments in all the 9 countries of the South Asia region, with very low representation of women leaders across South Asia, such as Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka. In India, women have a share of 10% in ministerial positions and 11% in the national parliament. And in South Asian countries, less than half of them have a constitutional quota for their women in national parliaments. In South Asia, interesting that only 7% of women are members of political parties. So there's a deep, depoliticisation of most women. Southeast Asia is slightly better, but not growing, at 18.5%. And the counterpoint with the economic argument is that even though women are often central to economic development in a lot of these countries by their agricultural labour and other types of labour, that's not being rewarded by political representation. So, for example, in China, women make up more than 70% of the rural labour force, yet they constitute only 21% of village committee members, with only 1 to 2% in decision-making positions, and only 21% of the National People's Congress members were women. We also know that around our region in particular, civil society organisations are very weak, and civil society organisations are a key part for women to both enter formal political representation, but also economic decision making. So basically the point of this analysis is that if we talk about development, we need to get far more interested in the political and decision-making context around these types of development decisions, not just focused on the outcome of the particular programs. And this is where I think the latest AusAid Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Women's Development program is a really great example of a more holistic type of intervention, because it fuses the idea of violence against women, women's economic rights and women's political participation, but it's also a 10-year long-term program with a significant amount of capital behind it and high-level political acceptance of it at the Pacific Island Forum. That is a development intervention that has some prospect of working. So that's when we're talking about what type of new development we might see that might shift some of these ideas, then that's the kind of direction we need to be heading in. So, something borrowed. And it goes to this Beyond Aid agenda. Now, the development agenda, as I said, has been moving from this idea of conflict and fragility in middle income poverty and conflict and fragility, but it's also affected by a whole lot of mega trends. Urbanisation in particular, technology, climate finance. I mean, most of the existing UN development architecture could be just snuffed out and made irrelevant by the amount of volume that we're going to see coming through climate finance and the ability of the UN system to cope with the idea of the development aspects of climate change, for example. So these mega trends are really important for us to be dealing with. And what we don't have at the moment in terms of the UN architecture, and it's not well reflected in the post-2015 debates either, is what I call the Beyond Aid agenda. It's an OECD term. In other words, what are the consequences for women and girls, or just gender analysis generally, of trade agreements, of security agreements like disarmament agreements, of remittances frameworks, of labour mobility programs, of disarmament frameworks, of technology transfer, of climate finance, of access to the global commons generally. That is the area in which we are so lacking. And this is something I think we might be able to borrow in some sense from the G20 development consensus, the idea of beyond aid. What are the issues that actually are going to lead to development outcomes for people? And in that, what is the demographic and social analysis and gender analysis we need to put into play? So that leads me to my test. How are you going to know whether there has been, in fact, a transformative shift around women's rights in the post-2015 debate? And you can ask Peter Baxter about this all you like tomorrow. That would be fine. He loves that. He loves it when you do that. So basically, we know that the MDGs, the time is running out, less than 1,000 days. We know gender-related disparities are still on the rise. We know financial support for women's rights and women empowerment remain lacking. So first part of the test is, what's going to happen for funding for UN Women? In 2012, it only got $218 million out of its operating budget of $300 million. And I think this year it's looking even worse. Even though there's more donors have put their hand up, they seem to be giving less money. Of a budget of $400 million. A budget of $400 million to take on the gender challenges I've outlined to you is not enough. And UN Women itself was the result of an incredibly long campaign with the worst name ever, Gender Equality Architecture Reform, or GEAR. Terrible, I still blush. But anyway, it's part of this long reform process to get this one, higher level policy architecture at the UN that would focus on these gender inequality issues, and it is woefully underfunded. So I say it's a really great put your money where your mouth is test for the UN and for its membership about whether we really care about inequality issues in the following one. The second will be, as I said, how are we progressing in the Beyond Aid agenda, and how are you even going to know that, because the UN architecture is so diffuse around this area. But we need to get much more clarity about what are the outcomes for women and girls of trade agreements, of disarmament agreements, etc. And the final one, I think, is pretty clear one. Will Western nations trade away the rights of women in Afghanistan next year? That'll be a really key test. After all the words, that will be an absolute key test. That's my 4-point test for you. And if I'm satisfied on all those 4 tests, we can come back and say to ourselves that gender issues have moved from the sidelines to the centre of human development. Why is this so important? Because I believe 2015 is going to be the year that we remember the way we remember the Universal Declaration or the Charter itself. Because it's a time where we're going to be challenged to put forward what is our vision of humanity. What is the UN's vision of humanity? So I want to see in that we have a clear recognition of the words in the UN Charter that we want to live in a world without gender inequality. And yet the words need to be matched by some sort of action. So vote pink. Yes, thank you.